For the purposes of this course, the genealogy of literary criticism begins at the Renaissance because of its rediscovery of what the medieval period had quote unquote lost, in a sense. That is, reading and writing that went beyond the members of the clergy and the works of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Since these literary works were considered to be superior to anything else that most of Western Europe had access to during that period, they gave rise to the very rules that were used to judge them. This would become what is now known as the neoclassical approach. Neoclassicism was less prominent in England than in other places for reasons having to do with religion, culture, economic status, and the presence of authors such as William Shakespeare. Shakespeare's literary art was widely popular in England and undeniably significant, but importantly broke most of the rules that literary scholars had inferred based on the classical literature that they used as models. The decline of neoclassicism was helped along by the development of a new important genre that once again did not play by any of the same rules as classical literature, the novel. This new form led to more emphasis on theories of literature that were subjective, examining the mental states of the reader and eventually also the author. This led to literary criticism focusing more on the communication of feelings and of that which the reader had not themselves ever experienced. There was, therefore, no way for classical theories which privileged mimesis, or how close the art can mimic its subject, to apply in this case, where, again, the worth of the literature was in its ability to communicate something very new and very different. The next major literary movement to follow, which also focused on the communication of that which transcends the everyday and familiar, is Romanticism. Romantics relied upon the writing of poetry, giving the poet themselves a sort of absolute power to appeal to a reader on this more fundamental level. According to Romantic poet and literary scholar Percy Shelley, poetry, quote, strips the veil of familiar world and lays bare the naked and sleeping beauty, which, as the chance for an unchecked transmission and profound emotion, clearly removed from the objective of new things taken by the classicists, was an important and powerful vision. British Romantics at this point began to look to individual passion, inspiration, symbolism, historical awareness, and considerations of aesthetics as they interpreted and judged what they read. The Romantic movement wasn't the only literary movement to come out of hopes for transcendent literature that would lead to a more perfect world for those who used it to communicate ideas. The literature of the French Revolution developed along those same lines, but to very different ends. Owners of industry and those in political power often limited the potential of the literature of the French Revolution to point out and criticize social problems. French authors began to see themselves as in opposition to middle to upper class bourgeoisie who existed in opposition to the subjugated working classes. Subsequently, authors such as Émile Zola in France began to see literature as having the potential to document the conditions of reality so as to expose injustice and bring about justice. The end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s saw a variety of literary traditions and corresponding literary theories start to flourish. Literary theory itself was now regarded as a discipline that could be studied to the highest extent of scholarship, the doctorate. New literary approaches sparked interest in new texts for study. A new appreciation for scientific thought was reflected in much of the new theoretical development. The advent of the 1900s, that is, of the 20th century, saw the refining of the study of literature. Scholarly techniques for research were normalized, factuality underpinning the interpretation of literature becomes much more sound. Interpretive techniques have been borrowed and adapted from other fields such as anthropology and linguistics. There is even less of a distinction between criticism produced by literary scholars versus the authors themselves, or those who simply love literature. The introduction of formalism, a movement away from impressionism, eventually led to what was called new criticism, and this was obviously a reaction against everything to come before it. And with new criticism came the reform and inclusion of literary education in colleges and universities all across the United States. New criticism rejected questions of authorial intent and came with a host of literary terminology to look for as part of the act of interpretation, such as allusion, paradox, and ambiguity, among others. As the 20th century progressed, the main question of literary theory became by what means can the most precise and complete knowledge of a literary work be arrived at? In this way, the chosen work for interpretation and analysis actually guides the decision of what theoretical approach or approaches to employ. And that's where the genealogy of literary theory and art leaves us. At this moment in the 21st century, there is a greater volume of literary art to be considered than ever before, and an even deeper and more robust repository of literary approaches and theories to use than at any other point in the last 600 years. So, the takeaway here is that what makes the entire literary tradition interesting for our study is the way that one thing leads to the next. We don't have individual periods, and frankly, even whole works of art are influenced by each other, by authors, by what's going on in history, and by the other works of art that are being written even at the very same time. This sense of interconnectedness then will help to better influence our discussions as we go on through the individual literary periods that we discussed this semester.